The Acquisition of Africa, 1870–1914. What were the reasons for Europe's interest in Africa? Before delving into the essence of colonialism in Africa, let us redirect our focus towards a fundamental query. What initially sparked Europe's interest in Africa? According to a renowned expert in Portuguese imperial history, the Portuguese were driven by various factors, including a fervent crusading spirit, the pursuit of valuable Guinea gold, the quest for Prester John, and the exploration for exotic spices. Additionally, an esteemed historian named Ali Mazrui identifies three overarching motives for European exploration of the African continent, ultimately paving the way for colonization. The primary motive stemmed from the pursuit of acquiring scientific knowledge about unexplored territories. Africa, often labeled as the Dark Continent, presented an intriguing and enticing opportunity. It was shrouded in an aura of mystery for European explorers who ventured forth. They endeavored to uncover and document the existence of rivers, lakes, and mountains, while also dedicating themselves to studying the diverse African cultures and recording their observations. The second reason arose from the ethnocentrism or racism prevalent in Europe, which was in part rooted in Western Christianity. Implicit in Christian doctrine, and also in Islam, I might add, is the belief that adherents of the faith should spread their respective religious texts, the Gospel or the Quran, to others and seek converts. Given that much of Africa followed their own traditional religious beliefs, Europeans perceived a pressing need to proselytize and convert Africans to Christianity. In the early stages of both Christianity and Islam, missionary endeavors often coincided with military campaigns. Subsequently, alternative methods of persuasion were employed. Missionaries were dispatched to Africa with the purpose of instructing Africans in European languages, thereby enabling them to assist in translating the Bible into African languages and facilitating the dissemination of Christian doctrines. One factor that contributed to imperialism was the ambition of European nationalists to enhance their nation's greatness by asserting control over distant territories. For instance, Cecil John Rhodes, a prominent figure from Britain, embarked on endeavors that resulted in significant portions of Central Africa being claimed for his king. The explorations led by Henry Morton Stanley in Africa also paved the way for King Leopold of Belgium to obtain the Congo, which ironically he named the Congo Free State. Additionally, Prince Henry of Portugal and subsequent explorers played a role in establishing the Estado da India, an early Portuguese empire in the Indian Ocean, often referred to as the first Portuguese global empire, upon which the sun never set. Frequently, exploratory journeys received direct sponsorship from European governments. In other instances, when missionaries or other explorers faced hostility or perilous situations, as exemplified by the case of Bishop Hamilton, who encountered religious resistance in Uganda and ultimately fell victim to murder under the orders of a local king, foreign troops were swiftly dispatched either to punish the involved groups or to safeguard other foreign nationals. Once foreign troops arrived, they inevitably remained, and soon thereafter colonization expeditions ensued. Following the establishment of colonial rule, missionaries and colonial authorities formed a remarkably close collaborative alliance. Across much of colonial Africa, schools were operated and managed by missionaries, although they received varying degrees of financial support from colonial governments. The primary objective of missionary education, from the perspective of colonial administrations, was to ensure that an adequate number of Africans were educated to meet the limited demand for semi-skilled labor within colonial bureaucracies. Mission schools propagated the notion that the presence of Europeans in Africa was intended to benefit the African populace and uplift them from a state of barbarism. African customs were actively discouraged, African languages were prohibited in mission schools, and African heritage was subjected to ridicule and suppression. The aim was to bestow upon Africans a new identity by compelling them to adopt new Christian names. In numerous ways, Western religion fostered submissiveness by emphasizing that earthly existence was transitory and should be utilized primarily to prepare for eternal life. Individuals were taught to embody Christian virtues of forgiveness, submissiveness, and patience in order to qualify for eternal life. Humiliation and suffering, such as those experienced by Africans during colonialism, were regarded as ennobling and spiritually purifying. What drove the Europeans to actively seek out colonies and empires in Africa? There are three distinct reasons that emerge, falling into the categories of political, strategic, cultural, and economic factors. The political impetus revolves around the intense rivalry between European nations during the 18th century, each vying for dominance in the global system. These nations believed that colonial possessions bestowed prestige and elevated their status. Even in present times, significant countries continue to compete for influence over smaller states. The competition witnessed between the United States and the former Soviet Union in the Cold War era, particularly in the so-called Third World, was driven in part by the pursuit of leadership and supremacy in global affairs. Consider the sense of pride and psychological self-importance experienced by Britain during the height of its imperial might, exerting control over an African territory that exceeded its own size by more than 40-fold. The primary factor behind colonization was the economic drive. Early literature on colonization extensively emphasized the vast resources and markets that Africa offered, along with the economic advantages European powers would gain by accessing the African continent. Historians argue that European countries pursued colonization of African states due to the inherent demands of capitalist economies. These economies not only required natural resources to fuel their own industrial revolutions, but also sought to exploit the abundant source of inexpensive labor. With the expansion of European economies, the need for captive markets in the Third World became crucial for disposing of surplus goods. In essence, the pursuit of wealth, trade, resources, and cheap labor served as the impetus for European expansion into Africa. The impetus for colonization arose from the deeply rooted ethnocentrism and cultural superiority complex prevalent among the European population. They firmly believed that individuals or societies deviating from their own cultural norms were inherently inferior. In the case of Africans, Europeans regarded them as technologically less advanced, often dismissing their unrecorded historical achievements, thus rendering them unfamiliar to the rest of the world. As a result, Europeans assumed a self-imposed responsibility to civilize and uplift the African people. Seeking to present colonization in a favorable light, advocates of this viewpoint employed language that seemingly portrayed the interests of the colonized as equal to, or even surpassing, those of the colonizers. Consequently, poets, writers, and intellectuals took on the task of providing moral and philosophical justifications for colonialism once the decision to establish colonies had been made. The civilizing missions of Europeans. Europe's colonization of Africa was justified by claiming a moral duty to uplift Africans from their perceived primitive state. However, substantial evidence suggests that Europeans held negative opinions about Africans and their culture and history. European writings from individuals who visited Africa prior to colonization reveal a biased perspective, as they interpreted Africa through their own cultural lenses, concluding that Africans were backward and uncivilized. The obsession with skin color and physical attributes as indicators of civilization was pervasive and unwavering. Consequently, Europeans believed that colonization was not only justified, but necessary to fulfill their mission of civilizing Africans. But how did they envision this mission? How did they plan to execute it? What kind of transformation did they anticipate in the African people once their mission was accomplished? Exploring the answers to these pivotal questions uncovers intriguing disparities among European colonizers and sheds light on their racial attitudes and the underlying assumptions of their civilizing mission. This, in turn, provides valuable insights into how they defined themselves as British, French, Portuguese, or Belgian. Colonial rule. Did Africans experience any advantages? there are significant negative aspects that deserve attention and consideration. Africa has experienced extensive exploitation, including the depletion of its resources, exploitation of labor, unfair taxation, and lack of industrialization, restrictions on inter-African trade, and the establishment of vulnerable economies dependent on a single crop or mineral. The manipulation of ethnic rivalries, particularly by the British through their policy of indirect rule, has left a lasting impact on post-independence conflicts in Africa. Traditional African authority structures were alienated and undermined by involving chiefs in colonial duties, making the process of nation-building much more challenging. The arbitrary drawing of borders has caused immense suffering in African nations, triggering political conflicts centered on territorial claims and counterclaims. African culture and values suffered severe damage through the imposition of foreign religions and relentless attacks on African traditions by missionary schools. These factors contributed to a sense of apathy, dependency, and a loss of confidence in African people, their institutions, and their heritage. The denial of political participation to colonized Africans hindered post-colonial political development, and the excessive use of force to address political issues during the colonial era has persisted into the post-colonial period. In general, there are 5 commonly acknowledged benefits associated with colonization that many scholars tend to agree upon. Firstly, the introduction of Western medicine has had a remarkable impact on the survival rates of the African population. It is worth noting that the rapid growth of the African population originated during the colonial era. Secondly, despite its often biased approach in many countries, the introduction of formal education played a role in broadening the outlook of Africans and unlocking their untapped potential. Missionaries played a significant part in providing education and healthcare services. The majority of post-World War II African leaders who emerged to lead their colonies towards independence acquired their rhetorical and organizational skills through colonial education. This enabled young political activists to challenge the existing order and demand the restoration of African dignity and freedom, drawing upon political and moral ideas deeply rooted in Western education. Thirdly, the modest infrastructure established by colonial authorities served as the basis upon which new African leaders built their national institutions. Initially, roads, railways, harbors, telephones, electricity, and water and sewerage systems were developed primarily to cater to the white colonial community or support small urban settlements. Africans gained valuable skills by working within colonial bureaucracies, and their experiences became crucial in maintaining these services during the often turbulent periods of political transition and beyond. Fourthly, the introduction of Islam and Christianity to African societies brought about a simplification of African spirituality and provided a common foundation for people from diverse backgrounds to unite. Africans have long been a deeply spiritual people, believing in God and an afterlife with ancestral spirits. However, the means to achieve salvation were often unclear. The role of ancestral spirits held immense significance, necessitating intricate and continuous rituals to appease or seek favor from them. While this spiritual heritage provided emotional and spiritual fulfillment, it also hindered the development of rational thought and scientific progress in various ways. Note: it's important to acknowledge that the topic of colonization and its effects is complex and highly debated. The rewritten text aims to present a neutral summary of certain perceived benefits of colonization, but it does not endorse or dismiss any particular viewpoint.